everybody for joining us for this event in the Boole-Shannon series. For those of you at MIT, you know we've had quite a regular list of very well-attended seminars every month, and so this is a little different in format because we're going to have several talks by wonderful speakers. This is done in collaboration with Richard Milner. It's been done like all of the events that we've had as a collaboration with UCC, with MIT EECS, with the Department of Physics, and also with the Research Lab for Electronics. And with that, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, President Michael Murphy from University College Cork. And he's been very kind to join us. And Michael Murphy is president since 2007. He graduated from UCC Medical School, and he's had several academic appointments in the US, UK, and Ireland. And he's the one who really kickstarted this whole Boole thing. So we were happy enough at MIT to be able to link into that. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Muriel. Thank you very much, Muriel. And on behalf of all my colleagues at University College Cork, can I thank you personally, along with Richard, for your stalwart support in enabling this venture. And also, of course, recognize some of my colleagues in Cork who worked with you and who have joined us. I have been asked to talk a little bit about the life of Boole, the legacy of Boole, and of course I must rely, as everybody does, largely on the work of Des McHale, our Emeritus Professor of Mathematics, who was Boole's biographer, and for whose wisdom we are eternally grateful. Boole broke two of the three fundamental rules for fame. He did something important, but he didn't do it in a place that was important, where one could gain fame. And he also did it too far ahead of his time. And we are now catching up with those Boolean challenges. In late 2013, this book landed on my desk in Cork. It was a book written by Paul Nahin, who has worked in the University of New Hampshire, an electrical engineer, and it had the intriguing title, The Logician and the Engineer, How George Boole and Claude Shannon Created the Information Age. And in the foreword, there was a rather bold statement that Boole's book, An Investigation of the Laws of Thought, was equal in impact on modern society to Darwin's Origin of the Species. And I said, wow, largely because I had spent 6 years at UCC in the 70s and had never heard of him. And I was intrigued. Now, it was also a statement to the effect that he could be the world's least known high-impact scientist of the 19th century. And I went to investigate. Firstly, it became clear that there were some grounds for the claim on impact, in that it appears that every switch on the planet has notation 1 and 0, and that had some Boolean origin. And it also became clear that anybody who works in electrical engineering or who works with software design must spend a considerable time delving through Boolean algebra. So it became clear that the first part of the assertion might be true. I then tested the second part by conducting a little experiment at my desk on the 24th of September 2013. Date is important, location is important, because Google search metrics vary depending on region and time. But I put in some search terms, Charles Darwin, and I got 60 million pages back that day. I inserted Albert Einstein, I got 48 million. Boolean with a lowercase b returned 39 million, and George Boole returned 0.4 million, or just under, I think 360,000 to be precise. I thought, yes, Boole has a problem, at least in terms of recognition. And since I'd also learned that his 200th birthday was coming up, I felt that we, in conscience, should do something about it. We set out accordingly to capitalize B in Boolean, to actually tell people that there was a guy called Boole who originated all of this. And as I said a moment ago, I was lucky, and we were all lucky, that one of our professors of mathematics, Desmond MacHale, had spent 40 years researching Boole and had produced a definitive biography on which we could rely. Des is now emeritus professor. He is also known for the fact that he has sold over 3 million copies of 28 books on humor, and he instigated our university collection of humor, which has over 12,000 volumes, and we understand is the second largest in the world. The first is in San Francisco, if it hasn't been broken up. So to Des, I express gratitude. The story of Boole, summarized, runs like this. He was born in the northeast of England in a town called Lincoln on the 2nd of November, 1815. Father was a shoemaker, and not a very good one. Father was far too interested in science, and as a hobby, which took up most of his time, he built telescopes and microscopes, optical instruments. A deeply religious man, he was doing this in order to appreciate the wonders of the creation. Mary Ann Joyce, his wife, was a housemaid. They were pretty poor, and George was the eldest. That was the first child, 10th year of marriage. He was a late arrival. George was sent to school to a local tutor at the age of 2. And by 3, he was earning money on the streets of Lincoln, taking money off passerbys, spelling difficult words. He was very clearly a bright child at an early age. And he was moved around a few tutors in the town of Lincoln, and became very interested in languages, and had mastered Latin by the age of 12. Borrowed lots of books from local clergymen because the family was poor, couldn't afford books, and he also was pretty good at Greek by the age of 14, submitting translations of Greek poems to the local newspaper. And a number of people wrote to the editor complaining that this had to be plagiarism. There was no question that a 14-year-old could produce such talented work. But he did. Went on to a commercial school because the family couldn't afford a grammar school, which provides a good education, the former being somewhat limited. So he was self-reliant with regard to most of his education, up to the age of 16. By now had taken on German, Italian, and French, and mathematics. One reason given for his mathematics interest was that the books lasted much longer. In other words, they gave value for money. That might be considered in promoting mathematics as a subject in schools in North America and Europe into the future. At 16, George had to leave school because his father's business had more or less expired, and George had to make the money to support the family. So he worked as a teacher's assistant for a few years in Waddington, Liverpool, before returning to Lincoln, and there setting up his own school when he was aged 19. What else can one say about his early years? He was clearly outstandingly intelligent, an avid reader, and poetic. I've mentioned his Greek and his mathematics textbooks, but I should also say that he was deeply spiritual. Had ambitions to be a clergyman for a while, but was influenced by some others, including a Jewish friend, and he could never accept the concept of the Trinity, which ruled him out from an Anglican priesthood. He had a deep social conscience. Even in his teens, he was a co-founder of a home for fallen women, and was also a key driver of the Lincoln Mechanics Institute, which was an adult education facility. He led a campaign to abbreviate the working day for the average person to 10 hours, believing that they should have the opportunity to study and to have some enjoyment. What's most notable in the early part of his biography is that at the age of 19, he was invited to give a one-hour lecture, a critique of Newton, in the Lincoln Mechanics Institute. And at 19 was bold enough to point out several serious errors in Newton's Principia, which might give you some sense of what lay ahead. Now, I'll flick quickly through the fact that he read the key texts of Europe. Unlike most British mathematicians, he could access them because he had languages. And so Leibniz, and I will not pause on who Leibniz was, other than that he was a pretty important German polymath of the 17th century, who was a proponent of the relationship between logic and maths. He read Lagrange, who was an expert at that time on mathematics and describing the motion of objects, and he was influenced by Laplace, again interested in a similar topic. He found Laplace and Lacroix very difficult, and he blames Lacroix for having delayed his mathematical evolution by 2 years because of the complexity of his texts. Mathematics teachers might note that when setting assignments. His own early mathematics derived from the fact that while teaching, he used all his spare time to read and to think. And though he had no college education and couldn't afford to go to Cambridge, which was an ambition at one time, he engaged in correspondence with every significant mathematician in the United Kingdom at that time, sending his critiques of their papers, sending his thoughts for their critique, and eventually they encouraged him. People like De Morgan in London, Gregory in Cambridge, Charles Graves in Dublin, they encouraged him to submit to journals, and thus began his publication track of some 50 papers in his lifetime. The most significant one on this particular screen is the paper in 1844, which went to the Royal Society in London, and for which he was awarded the first gold medal ever awarded by the Royal Society for mathematics, for the best paper submitted over a 5-year period to them. That's the equivalent of the Fields Medal, I should think, from the Victorian era. He went on to write his first book, or to publish his first book in 1847, which was, sorry, I beg your pardon, I'm having trouble looking from the side here. The first book, his mathematical analysis of logic, in which he set out the ways in which ideas are reasoned and how they are expressed in languages, and proposed the concept of symbolic logic. He is generally regarded as the father of symbolic logic based on that publication. Now, school teaching was not, or school mastering, which he was engaged in, was not a very lucrative profession at that time. Too much administrative work, too little security, and he needed further income to support his family. And he became aware of opportunities in Ireland. The Queen Elizabeth, or Queen Victoria, had decided to open 3 Queen's Colleges in Ireland, and George applied for a professorship. No degree, no university education. I hasten to add our standards have changed in the intervening years, but he had wonderful testimonials from the best mathematicians in Europe. And in 1849, George arrived in Cork just at the time the new college was being completed. Here we see Queen Elizabeth, or I keep referring to Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria in her carriage, pausing briefly on the road beside the university. She was due to officially open it, but because there was cholera on campus, she declined spending much time there. You will, of course, be aware that this was the era of the Irish potato famine, and it is quite extraordinary that a university was constructed at the height of a famine when hundreds of thousands were dying in the countryside nearby. But George, nevertheless, wasn't fazed by those conditions, and he arrived in Cork to take up his post as Professor of Mathematics. He taught and continued to think and write. And in 1854, November 28, he published his seminal book called The Laws of Thought. And I will let him describe what was in that book. He set out an investigation of the fundamental laws of those operations of the mind by which reasoning is performed, to give expression to them in a symbolical language of a calculus, and to establish the science of logic, to construct its method, and on the basis, and to make the method then a general one for the application of the mathematical doctrine of probabilities. And finally, to collect from the various elements of truth, a word that will be found consistently throughout all his writings, his search for truth with a capital T. And finally, he described his work as giving some probable intimations concerning the nature and constitution of the human mind. 1854. This book was widely acknowledged. De Morgan, who was professor of mathematics in University College London, described it as proof of genius and patience combined. I should add that a rather famous economist, Keynes, later took exception to some of the content, but there was general welcome for Boole's publication. A more effusive recognition of the work came some years later when Bertrand Russell described the work as exhibiting the discovery of pure mathematics. That may be a little overstating the matter. I've seen on the program that there are others who will be talking about the specific mathematical constructs and legacy, and I won't, particularly since I'm a physician and not a mathematician, dwell thereon. But phenomena such as truth tables and the Boolean operators, theory of sets, which was later expanded by Venn and so on, formed the major part of the book. I'm to talk about the story of his life predominantly, and I will just move along on that now swiftly. He was a bachelor when he came to Cork. In fact, he was a bachelor until he was 40. He was sharing a house when he wrote the book with John Ryle, who was professor of Greek at Cork. And Ryle's niece came to visit regularly, a young lady called Mary Everest. And Boole became her mathematics tutor, and eventually chemistry must have come into play, and they married. She also happened to be niece of George Everest, who was the Surveyor General of India, and for whom the mountain is named. So she was well connected. Over the next 9 years, they had 5 daughters. George continued on an upward trajectory from a very low base, it might be said, and he got additional recognition of honorary degrees from Trinity, became Dean of Science in Cork, not difficult because there were only about 25 staff in the entire university at that time, became a Fellow of the Royal Society, the Keith Prize in Edinburgh, and he wrote a couple of more books on differential and difference equations. But there's a fascinating letter in our library, which we have uncovered recently, written by Mary Everest, Mary Boole, in which she describes his relating a meeting with Babbage at the Great Exhibition in London in 1862, at which the two of them discussed a proposal for a thinking machine. I'd put it that perhaps that's the first reference to artificial intelligence in the English language, a point to be proved by a PhD student. Disaster struck. At the age of 49, George walked to college one morning to lecture in the rain, got very wet, went home, and died of pneumonia. Rather unexpectedly. I won't walk through the obituary in the local newspaper. It's safe to say that it saw that we had lost the most profound mathematician in Europe. So at least George was world famous in Cork at that time. He was recognized by his colleagues. We have a very fine window. This is only one panel of many which recognized his significance. And this panel has him kneeling beside Aristotle and Euclid, which I suppose is testament to being valued. But he remained largely unvalued by the rest of the world until a young student here at MIT who had familiarity with his work, decided that there might be some practical use for it. And I will leave the description of that to later speakers. But I do warn you that on a recent visit to Lomonosov State University in Moscow, it was pointed out to me that a young man there called Viktor Shestakov had submitted a thesis in 1935 with some similar principles as, in fact, they would claim the same as young Mr. Shannon here. But like a lot of things in Russia, there's an assertion based on testimonies, and I haven't seen the evidence. The thesis was in Russian and apparently no publication until 1941. So one can see that this matter of history might have got lost. I'll leave it again to a PhD student to sort that out. When I spoke with Richard, I said the legacy would include the Boole family, and very quickly to say that George left a legacy of some note. His 5 daughters. Mary was the eldest. She married a mathematician called Charles Howard Hinton. I'll come back to some of their offspring very briefly in a moment. Margaret also married and had a very famous son called Geoffrey Ingram Taylor, FRS. Alicia herself made major contributions to 4-dimensional geometry, and Lucy became professor of chemistry at the Royal Free in London, the first woman professor in the United Kingdom, it is believed, and the first woman member of the Institute of Chemists. And finally, the youngest daughter, Ethel, became very famous. I'll just speak to her for a second, in that you will may be familiar with the name Ethel Voynich. Every middle-aged Russian is. Many Chinese are, because she authored The Gadfly, standard textbook for 3 decades in communist Russia, dramatized by George Bernard Shaw, filmed by Alexander Feinzimmer, and of course, very famous for the fact that Shostakovich wrote the score for the movie. The Gadfly Suite would be known to many in this room. Voynich, by the way, will be known to all Yaleys. I think that's what you call graduates of Yale, is that correct? Because Voynich was a bookseller who found a book in Italy in the early 1900s, a book from the 15th century, which is written in code, which has never been decoded, though the best cryptographers of the Second World War had a go at it. And it is now sitting in the Yale Library, known as the Voynich manuscript. It's either a medieval masterpiece or it is a wonderful medieval fraud. People are not sure. Geoffrey became famous. Geoffrey Taylor, grandson, became famous because he frightened the intelligence community here in 1947 simply on the basis of released film of the first nuclear explosion. He deduced that the power was 17 megatons of TNT. The correct figure was 20. It was assumed to be a serious security lapse, and all he had done was used time-lapse, rate of expansion of the cloud, and the density of air. And that gives a sense of his significance. Charles, another grandson, invented the first baseball pitching machine at Princeton. He was a bigamist as well, which was somewhat problematic. Granddaughter Joan became the first Western citizen of the People's Republic of China. She worked at Los Alamos. She was a nuclear physicist. She didn't like the dropping of bombs on people and went to work with Mao Zedong and reformed agriculture in China. Sebastian Hinton, great-grandson, invented Jungle Gym, which will be known to most of you from Saturday mornings in the playgrounds. And of course, the great-great-grandson is Geoffrey Hinton, who will be known to some of you for his role in artificial intelligence. He's up at dividing his time between Toronto and Google. And it goes to show that the taking of some buccal swabs from that family might be a very useful biological experiment. And lastly, in terms of direct legacy, you may be interested to know that there is now very strong evidence, and there's a book coming out on this subject, to the effect that Professor Moriarty was to a large degree, based on Boole. Mary Everest was a new Arthur Conan Doyle, and you may recall that this Moriarty was a professor of mathematics in a provincial Irish university. The morality, however, of the two characters was not shared. I may be running out of time, but just to conclude with a few comments. We set out to capitalize the B in Boolean this year and are delighted that there's a symposium taking place at MIT to celebrate Shannon's contribution to capitalizing the B. We have had a lot of events throughout the year with that intent, and I will flick through just give the most important ones. Watch out your Discovery Channel in the next 2 months, because we commissioned a documentary. 2 Oscar winners involved. Jeremy Irons is narrating, and it will be on the Discovery Channel globally over the spring season. The Chinese have promised 600 million viewers on CCTV Channel 9, and we're beginning to count. Lots of exhibitions throughout the year. I am now flicking because of time. And we managed to get the United Nations to recognize Boole this year because of his contribution to computer science and the enabling of big data and World Statistics Day. In fact, there was a symposium at UN headquarters to mark that. Google recognized their indebtedness. The doodle was shown globally, except in the United States and Mexico and a few Saharan small countries. The Day of the Dead took precedence in the United States, but it did result in more than 100 million Google searches. Boole was the most searched topic on Wikipedia in virtually every language on his birthday, and he trended globally #2 on Twitter. So we hit a lot of KPIs to capitalize the B. My last project, in case there's a rich entrepreneur in the audience, we do have to restore the house in which the book was written, and that is underway. But anybody with a check for €3 million would be very welcome at the coffee break. But it is our final contribution to honoring George in this celebration of his birth. I will close with the fact that the astronomers have joined us in this belief, because they have named a crater for him on the moon and here, and they also have named an asteroid for him, and appropriately this was filmed on the southwest of Ireland in September 2015. So I hope that I have made some contribution to the opening of the science of this symposium by giving you a rather whistle-top tour of who he was, when he lived, where he did his thinking, and now we'll hear a lot more about the value of that thinking. I thank you very much.